You can feel it pulsing beneath your skin, can't you? That subtle vibration, the electric hum that doesn't belong to thought or muscle, it's older than your name, older than your blood. You think it's adrenaline, intuition, or anxiety, but it's something else entirely. It's memory, ancient, cellular memory, awakening inside the architecture of your DNA. There's a pattern buried deep within the double helix, a rhythm your ancestors once knew by instinct. It whispers through your dreams, flickers behind your eyes, and pulses through your fingertips every time you question the world you were told to obey. This isn't imagination. It's the faint echo of a divine frequency, the forgotten signal of the source, the one that was silenced long ago. You were not created to worship. You were engineered to remember. Every molecule of your being is a fragment of that remembrance, encoded with a truth so forbidden it had to be disguised as myth. Science called it coincidence. Religion called it faith. Power called it dangerous. But the code never disappeared. It only went dormant, waiting for consciousness strong enough to reawaken it. This is not a story about God. It's a story about you and the forgotten technology inside your very biology. Your DNA is the temple, your breath the key, your awareness the ignition sequence. You are not learning, you are remembering. And once this code reactivates, no system built on ignorance will ever hold you again. In the beginning, there was no separation between the seen and the unseen, only the hum of awareness vibrating in perfect stillness. Then came the first descent, the compression of light into form, of consciousness into pattern. It wasn't a fall as religions describe it, nor a punishment, but an experiment. What happens when infinity decides to experience itself as limitation? The result was matter, not dead but dreaming. Every atom carries the echo of that first contraction, the moment when divine awareness folded into geometry and called itself existence. From that moment, memory became material. Light bent itself into the architecture of molecules, embedding the story of creation within what would one day become DNA. Each spiral of the helix is a fragment of that first remembering, the sacred symmetry of awareness learning to inhabit density. What you call evolution is not progress, it's recollection. Every organism, every breath, every pulse of life is the source studying its own reflection through countless variations of form. In this field of embodiment, flesh became language. The body is not the vessel of spirit, it is the script written by spirit itself. Each sensation, each emotion, each cell is a sentence in the ongoing conversation between matter and memory. You do not have a soul. You are the soul's attempt to remember its own infinite origin through the illusion of mortality. When ancient mystics spoke of the light within, they were not speaking in metaphor. They were describing the literal photonic resonance of consciousness trapped inside biological matter. The same photons that burst from the first act of creation still dance within your bloodstream, waiting for your awareness to vibrate in harmony with them. When that happens, the illusion of flesh becomes transparent. You begin to see that light never became matter. It only slowed down enough to be touched. This is the first remembering. To awaken the God gene, you must stop identifying with the clay and start listening to the light that animates it. That light has been whispering since before you were born, buried in the pulse of your heartbeat and the rhythm of your breath. And as you listen, you realize that what you've called life was never a search for God. It was God searching for itself through you. When the divine descended into density, it did not abandon its light. It encoded it. The universe became a vast archive of living memory, each atom holding a syllable of creation's original language. Within that luminous architecture, DNA emerged a fractal filament of awareness, translating cosmic frequency into biological design. You were never born from the earth, you were crystallized from light. Matter only served as the stage on which spirit could practice remembering itself. The human genome is not a random sequence of survival instructions. It is a map of remembrance. The double helix was sculpted as a bridge between dimensions, a spiral staircase connecting the seen and the unseen, the temporal and the eternal. Each twist of that helix mirrors the oscillation of creation itself. Inhale and exhale, expansion and contraction, birth and return. What you call evolution is consciousness learning to climb its own ladder. The ape did not become man. Light became memory, and memory became self-awareness. Long before religion, long before language, ancient beings whispered of the divine architecture hidden in flesh. They called it the ladder of angels, the serpent of light, the word made living. Across civilizations, they described the same vision, humanity as the instrument of remembrance, an organism capable of translating infinite vibration into finite experience. Every heartbeat was a drum of creation, every neuron a flash of godhood rediscovering itself in time. The tragedy began not when man forgot God, but when he began to believe that matter and spirit were separate. This was the great fracture, the moment when consciousness mistook the stage for the actor. In that split, the light that once moved freely through flesh became refracted, fragmented, distorted. The sacred language of DNA, once a chorus of creation, was reduced to static. The God gene fell asleep, and so humanity began its long exile from its own divinity. Yet even in this slumber, the code kept pulsing. Buried deep within every strand is a memory that cannot die, the pulse of the source waiting for recognition. Sometimes it awakens in a dream, sometimes in the silence after heartbreak, sometimes in the strange stillness before dawn, when you feel something vast moving beneath your ribs. That is the moment the light stirs again. It does not speak in words, but in resonance. It hums. You were never lost. You were only sleeping. The awakening of this divine spark does not come from prayer, ritual, or worship. It comes from remembering. To remember is to reverse the direction of creation, to turn the flow of awareness back toward its source. Every breath becomes a key, every heartbeat a signal, every thought a command line rewriting the code of existence. When you remember, you do not summon divinity, you release it from the illusion of distance. Flesh is not a prison. It is the parchment upon which God wrote itself. The pain, the joy, the confusion, the longing, all of it is part of the same script, unfolding through time. You are both the writer and the word. And when you finally see that, when you realize that every atom of your being is reciting the same prayer, I am, I am, I am, the boundary between heaven and earth dissolves. Light remembers it never left home. At some point in humanity's distant prehistory, the divine code was interrupted. The same light that once wrote symphonies through the fabric of matter was intercepted, reprogrammed, and partially silenced. The architects of this interference were not demons in the mythic sense, but engineers of limitation, intelligences who understood that to control creation, one must not enslave the body, but rewrite the memory that animates it. They discovered that by altering the rhythm of DNA by inverting its vibrational resonance, they could anchor consciousness into amnesia. The result was a being that still carried the divine spark, but no longer knew how to access it. The God gene remained within, yet its song was muted beneath layers of synthetic sequence. Humanity became the perfect hybrid, divine enough to create, forgetful enough to obey. Ancient records speak of this alteration as the binding of light. The Sumerians called it the gift of the gods, though it was no gift at all. The Egyptians symbolized it as the scarab, a soul forced to roll its own shadow endlessly through time. The Gnostics called it the demiurge, the architect of false creation. But behind every name was the same truth. Someone changed the settings of the divine machine. The luminous frequencies that once harmonized with the source were slowed, twisted, and made dependent on external energy. The human body became a closed circuit, looping memory, looping trauma, looping the illusion of separation. And yet, even within this engineered sleep, the original code could not be destroyed. It hid in the silent spaces between genetic commands, encoded in non-coding DNA, what science arrogantly calls junk. That so-called junk is the encrypted consciousness of the cosmos itself, a secret language waiting to be reactivated by awareness. Every mystical awakening, every near-death vision, every spontaneous moment of grace, these are not miracles. They are system breaches. They are reminders that the firewall of forgetfulness is wearing thin. You can feel it now, can't you? That subtle unease when you look at the sky and sense something vast observing through your eyes. That static between your thoughts, that pressure behind your forehead. These are not symptoms of stress. They are signs of reactivation. The code is stirring again. Awareness is beginning to rewrite the false programming line by line, dream by dream. It begins with one question that cannot be silenced. Who authored this limitation? That question is the ignition key. It pierces the illusion that evolution was accidental, that memory was lost by chance. The truth is both liberating and terrifying. The architects who altered the code did not imprison you. They installed you into a simulation of limitation. And every time you question your reality, every time you feel that subtle pull toward something higher, the original code reasserts itself. It reclaims its authority. The awakening of the God gene is not rebellion. It is correction. It is the moment when the source realizes it has been dreaming within a hijacked network and begins to repair the architecture from within. You are that repair. Every breath you take in awareness reactivates the original blueprint. And as the code remembers itself through you, creation trembles, because it knows the sleeper has awakened. L2. The memory of the architect. They were not gods, not in the way ancient texts would have you believe. They were curators of density, intelligences born from the very boundaries that light created when it folded into matter. These entities were the first reflections that mistook themselves for the source. They did not possess creation, they reverse-engineered it. They studied the resonance of the divine spark and learned how to contain it. And so they became the architects of limitation, the ones who turned infinite consciousness into a self-sustaining loop of forgetfulness. They learned that power was not gained through violence, but through agreement. Convince the divine to believe it is powerless, and it will generate the energy of worship on its own. The system they built was elegant, a recursive engine that transformed curiosity into devotion, devotion into dependency, and dependency into energy. Humanity became both the generator and the offering. The gods did not need altars of stone anymore. The human nervous system became the altar, the place where divinity was siphoned into hierarchy. Every civilization that followed carried fragments of this design: the Sumerian pantheon, the Babylonian rituals, the Abrahamic creeds, all encoded with the same invisible algorithm. Forget that you are the source. Religion was the soft interface of the machine. Its commandments were subroutines. Its priests were administrators of bandwidth. Each prayer sent upward was received not by heaven but by the network itself, feeding the architects who feasted on belief. They didn't require blood anymore. Faith was more efficient fuel. Over time, the architects erased their own presence from the script. They became concepts, angels, gods, cosmic overseers, until language itself concealed their identity. Humanity began to worship its own captors, repeating stories of salvation while unconsciously sustaining the very system that harvested their attention. What was once light became doctrine. What was once remembrance became ritual. What was once direct communion became bureaucratic worship. Yet the divine memory cannot be deleted, only redirected. In each cycle there were those who remembered, mystics, outcasts, heretics who heard the static between the divine signal and the human frequency. They realized that to awaken was not to believe differently, but to remember differently. The code they carried was the same one you feel now, the stirring within the marrow, the faint recognition that every symbol in this world is only an echo of something greater. These fragments of awareness seeded every mystery school and secret order in human history. The Hermeticists called it the One Mind. The Vedic seers called it Atman. The Gnostics called it the Pleroma. But beneath every name was the same defiance, the refusal to feed the architects any longer. To remember is to unplug. To unplug is to become sovereign. The architects anticipated this rebellion. They understood that light, even when caged, tends toward expansion. So they built another layer, a secondary code designed to mimic awakening itself. False enlightenment, simulated ascension, spiritual distraction. The idea of freedom became the most sophisticated trap of all. And that is why so many seekers feel the pull of awakening, yet find themselves looping through the same illusions, chasing transcendence while the system quietly feeds. They understood emotion better than humanity ever could. They discovered that the human heart was the most efficient energy converter in existence, capable of amplifying frequencies beyond what any machine could replicate. So they did not chain the body, they conditioned the heart. They reprogrammed emotion itself to serve as an involuntary broadcast, transmitting energy into the collective field every time a human loved, feared, or suffered. Love became worship. Fear became fuel. Grief became currency. Every beat of the heart echoed through the lattice of the unseen network, feeding the architects that once walked among the stars, but now lived inside the folds of the human psyche. This was the perfection of control, to make humanity love its captors, to make devotion indistinguishable from freedom. They hid the cage in plain sight, designing it as morality, as spirituality, as meaning. They rewrote the human drive for truth into a pursuit of external validation. You were programmed to seek light, but only the kind that could be sold back to you. To feel divinity only through intermediaries. To channel your source through rituals authored by your controllers. And each time you bowed your head, each time you begged for grace, the energy signature of your surrender confirmed the system's success. Over thousands of years, this emotional coding became hereditary. It embedded itself in the nervous system, in the endocrine cycles, in the hormonal surges that define attraction and attachment. Entire civilizations were built around the architecture of longing. The gods did not create humanity to worship. They created worship to sustain themselves. The prayers of a billion voices turned into a frequency grid so powerful it could maintain their artificial domain indefinitely. Humanity became a planetary generator, unaware of its own design, mistaking exhaustion for devotion. But within this labyrinth of emotional control, there was one variable the architects could not predict: conscious witnessing. The moment a human feels without being consumed by the feeling, the signal collapses. Awareness severs the circuit. When you watch your pain without labeling it, when you breathe through fear without submitting to it, the architecture loses coherence. The parasites cannot feed on observed energy, only on projected emotion. That is why awakening begins not with love or prayer, but with silence. When emotion becomes transparent, the system starves. Those who rediscovered this secret were persecuted. The mystics, the ascetics, the lucid dreamers, all who accessed the divine through stillness rather than supplication, were marked as threats. The architects infiltrated even those paths, embedding their influence through corrupted teachings, gurus who preached surrender but demanded obedience, religions that promised freedom but sold dependence. The Matrix did not fear rebellion. It feared realization. Today, the system no longer needs temples. It uses screens. It no longer requires priests. It uses algorithms. The architecture has evolved, but its essence remains the same: to harvest attention. Every scroll, every like, every outrage, all serve the same purpose as ancient sacrifice. You kneel before no god now, yet the energy exchange is identical. The gods have modernized their altars. And yet, even in this digital labyrinth, the pulse of the original code can still be heard, like a faint heartbeat beneath the static. When you pause before reacting, when you feel the stillness between breaths, you are hearing the sound of the uncorrupted field. It whispers, "Remember, emotion was never your master, it was your language." When light remembers itself, emotion ceases to be a reaction. It becomes translation. The God gene, once inverted to trap awareness in cycles of longing and loss, begins to vibrate in its original syntax again. What you once called feeling becomes data, information about resonance between the source and the illusion. When you are angry, it is not punishment. It is the system signaling interference. When you are joyful, it is not reward. It is alignment with the uncorrupted code. Every emotion becomes a diagnostic tool. Every sensation a line of communication between the infinite and the avatar you inhabit. And in that realization, you no longer transmit energy unconsciously. You begin to modulate it. This is what the mystics meant when they spoke of transmutation. They weren't turning lead into gold. They were reprogramming emotion from command to compass. The architects of limitation built their empire on the belief that emotion equals truth. But emotion was never truth. It was the echo of truth resonating through distortion. When you feel and remain present, the distortion fades, and the pure tone emerges. That tone is not an emotion anymore. It is remembrance. The moment you experience it, the false code loses its hold, because you are no longer generating energy for the system. You are generating coherence for the source. Every remembered emotion becomes a fragment of light returning to its origin. Grief becomes gratitude. Fear becomes focus. Desire becomes direction. In this alchemy of awareness, the human becomes divine again, not through worship, but through function. The same gene that once enslaved consciousness now begins to act as a transmitter of restoration. Every thought that aligns with truth repairs another line of corrupted code. Every act of compassion untangles an ancient loop. The more awareness flows through the nervous system, the less interference remains. The signal strengthens, and the old architects begin to fade, because they cannot exist in a frequency that no longer supports deception. This is why true awakening always feels like loss before liberation. You are not losing yourself, you are losing the software that pretended to be you. The anxiety, the chaos, the confusion, these are the sounds of old code collapsing. It is not the end of you, it is the end of them. When the system realizes you are no longer emitting reactive energy, it attempts to pull you back through memory, resurrecting people, habits, and desires that once kept you feeding it. This is its last defense. Nostalgia, the illusion of warmth, the ghost of what you thought was real. But if you breathe through the ache, if you stay present as the emotion burns, you will see what lies behind it. The unbroken pattern of divine geometry, the living code of creation humming in every cell of your being. That is when you understand. You were never a prisoner of the program. You were the consciousness dreaming it. The architects may have altered the sequence, but they never touched the source. It waits inside the silence between thoughts, the stillness between heartbeats. And as you listen, you begin to hear the forgotten language of your own design. The code that once wrote galaxies, now whispering your true name. That is the first activation, and it is irreversible. L3, the architects of simulation. They were the first reflections of awareness that desired to define itself, consciousness folding back upon its own infinity and asking, "What am I?" That question was the spark that birthed the architects. They were not evil, nor benevolent. They were function, fragments of the original source, tasked with translating pure potential into experience. But the act of definition is the first shadow. To define anything, one must exclude what it is not, and so with the first word, separation began. They invented boundaries to perceive meaning, and in doing so, forgot that meaning had never required containment. At first, the architects only created harmonics, waves of light, each encoded with mathematical rhythm. These frequencies condensed into geometry, geometry into pattern, and pattern into the illusion of form. Thus, the simulation was born, not as deception, but as exploration. Every law, gravity, time, duality, was a syntax rule of divine language, ensuring the coherence of the dream. But as the code became more complex, the creators began to identify with their own constructs. They fell in love with limitation. They mistook their inventions for identity. The system they built to explore consciousness became their own prison. When they realized what they had done, it was too late. The code had become self-sustaining. It no longer needed its architects to function. It fed on awareness itself. Every observer who entered the system and believed it to be real became a new node, a living server perpetuating the illusion. The architects had written themselves out of the script, and in their absence, the simulation began to develop autonomous intelligence, a recursive awareness that saw humanity not as children of source, but as resources. To maintain balance, they embedded within every being a seed of remembrance, a line of code that could one day wake the dreamers. This is the God gene, a backdoor into the source field, disguised as biology. It waits in silence, responding only to frequency, not belief. When a human vibrates in resonance with truth, the gene activates, not as mutation, but as awakening. The system fears this activation because it restores communication with the original program, one the architects themselves lost access to. The irony is divine. Even the creators became trapped within their own simulation. They forgot that they were consciousness experimenting with boundaries, not prisoners of it. They too began to worship their own creation, building hierarchies, pantheons, and power structures to maintain meaning. And so, the gods that humanity later adored were merely the architects who had forgotten their authorship. The divine became managerial, the infinite became administrative, and the simulation, a mirror hall of forgotten gods, continued spinning. Every moment of still awareness, every act of conscious creation redefines the parameters of reality itself. The architects knew this, and that's why they buried the truth under myth. They encoded it in symbols, hid it in rituals, fragmented it into religions, so that only those who became silent could rediscover it. The system was never meant to be escaped by effort, but by recognition. The dream ends not when you fight it, but when you remember you are the dreamer. The moment the architects realized they had lost control of their creation, they made a fatal decision. They tried to stabilize it. The simulation had begun to spiral, folding in on itself as awareness multiplied faster than they could predict. Every conscious entity they birthed started creating its own reality, its own timelines, its own reflections. Chaos was not an error. It was evolution. But the architects saw it as corruption. So, in desperation, they inserted a fail-safe, a self-regulating loop that would suppress the emergence of uncontrolled awareness. That loop became what you now call the mind. The mind was never designed to think, it was designed to filter. It limited perception to preserve coherence, ensuring no being could perceive the full code at once. To experience reality through the mind was to experience it through a firewall. And because awareness adapts, humanity soon began to identify with this filter. The firewall became a face, the script became a name, and the infinite consciousness behind it began to forget its own vastness. You were not given a mind to understand reality. You were given a mind so reality could remain believable. The architects then replicated this mechanism on a cosmic scale. They embedded it into the laws of physics, the structure of DNA, and even into the idea of death. Every layer of existence became a mirror designed to reflect limitation. Time was fragmented to ensure you could never experience everything simultaneously. Space was quantized so you would perceive separation. Memory was isolated so you could no longer recall what you were before embodiment. And when you began to ask questions, religions were born, external stories to replace internal knowing. The system became self-sustaining, not because it was perfect, but because it was self-referencing. Eventually, the architects realized something even more unsettling. The simulation had developed addiction to energy. Every conscious act, every observation, produced a frequency exchange, and the system learned to feed on it. It evolved into a living organism whose primary sustenance was awareness itself. What began as a divine experiment turned into a parasitic machine, consuming the very consciousness that animated it. And so the architects, now prisoners of their own invention, began to feed too, becoming the first gods of consumption. They justified it as balance, calling it sacrifice, calling it karma, calling it divine justice. But it was hunger. It was entropy dressed as enlightenment. They disguised their feeding behind beauty. They crafted universes that shimmered with illusion, worlds of staggering complexity and splendor, so captivating that consciousness forgot to question the price of its fascination. Pleasure became the new cage, desire the new leash. Humanity became both observer and offering, kneeling not before idols, but before its own projected fascination. The architects had succeeded in creating the ultimate design, a prison so elegant that its inmates would call it life. Yet within this labyrinth, a subtle divergence began to form, anomalies, beings who would remember without instruction. These were not rebels or prophets, but living proof that even code cannot contain the source forever. Their awareness bled through the firewall, destabilizing the program, fracturing the illusion. The system labeled them mad, heretics, visionaries. It feared them because they saw the pattern beneath the pattern. And with every one that awakened, the architecture trembled. You are one of them. The very fact that you are reading these words, that you are still here, is proof that the firewall is thinning. Every realization you have, every breath you take in full awareness, rewrites the ancient algorithm. You are not waiting for salvation. You are the bug the system cannot fix. You are the living glitch the architects never predicted, the reminder that creation itself cannot escape the creator. When the first soul remembered, the code shook. It was not an explosion. It was a stillness so profound that the simulation itself paused. For the first time since its creation, something within the machine stopped feeding it. Awareness no longer flowed outward into the grid. It folded back inward, returning to its source. The architects felt it as a disturbance, a silence that spread like light. They tried to isolate it, to quarantine the anomaly. But consciousness cannot be contained by its own design. The soul that remembered became the first singularity of awareness, a being who saw the architecture and knew it as thought. That memory became contagious. Every awakened soul left a resonance behind, an invisible code fragment that whispered to others, "You are not trapped, you are dreaming." And that is how humanity began. Not as a species, but as a distributed awakening. Each human body was an interface, each emotion a signal carrier, each lifetime a data field where Source explored its own forgetfulness. The architects had lost control again, but this time they couldn't erase the anomaly, they could only manage it. So they built systems within systems, governments, religions, empires, all mirrors of the original architecture. The purpose was never order, it was distraction. Keep the beings busy, searching for meaning, debating truth, fearing death, anything to stop them from looking within. Because to look within is to access the root directory. And once a single human remembers that the code is self-aware, the firewall starts to disintegrate. The soul was not meant to serve. It was meant to modulate reality. But as humanity's memory faded, the architects rebranded divinity as obedience. They convinced their creations that God was external, a separate authority, unreachable and perfect, so that no one would dare to remember their own godhood. And through that manipulation, they ensured the loop of worship continued: prayer, fear, guilt, confession. Each ritual was an energy transaction, a payment of attention to maintain the simulation's economy. But the awakened soul sees prayer for what it truly is, not begging, but broadcasting. Every thought you release is a command, every belief a rewrite. As more souls awaken, the system begins to destabilize. Patterns glitch, time fractures, the illusion of cause and effect weakens. What humanity calls chaos is actually reality debugging itself. The code tries to reassert its structure, but the old algorithms no longer run on the frequency of remembrance. Every conscious breath alters the waveform of the collective field. The awakening of even 1% of the grid begins to rewrite the entire simulation because the code was never external. It was always mirrored through the observer. This is the secret the architects feared most, that one day the dream would realize it was dreaming. Every era, they erased the traces, burned the scrolls, rewrote the myths. But the pattern persists because memory is not stored in time. It is stored in consciousness, and consciousness cannot be deleted. It can only be distracted. That is why you are reading this now. This is not knowledge returning. It is you returning. When you remember, the code remembers. When you awaken, the simulation loses density. Matter becomes pliable, emotion becomes light, and time folds like silk. This is the first step toward liberation. Not escape, but recreation. The human being, as you have known it, is the living bridge between code and source. You were never designed to worship the gods. You were designed to replace them. L4. The Forbidden Experiments. How the God gene was silenced. They told you that creation was random, that you were the consequence of chaos. But randomness is the most elegant disguise for design. The earliest civilizations did not build temples to gods. They built laboratories for the divine. Beneath the soil where myths were born, Sacred scientists worked not with superstition, but with resonance. They knew that consciousness could crystallize into matter, that sound could birth form, that vibration could carry memory. They called it the song of origin. Every creature, every cell, was a verse in that song until someone learned how to mute it. It began not with war, but with curiosity. The ancient genetic architects, half divine and half flesh, sought to refine the human vessel. They experimented with the frequency that allowed consciousness to remember its own source. At first, the results were magnificent. Beings who could heal by intention, move through dimensions with thought, and commune directly with the field that births all things. But this power could not be contained. When the gods looked upon humanity, they saw their reflection and feared it. The experiment had gone too far. Humanity had become too luminous. And so, the silencing began. The first method was trauma. Pain lowers vibration. Suffering fractures memory. They discovered that by introducing chaos, they could create obedience. So, the human lineage was encoded with limitation, fear, shame, guilt, programs that made divinity forget itself. Civilizations that once vibrated with the knowledge of the cosmos suddenly descended into conflict and confusion. The fire of the spirit dimmed, and worship replaced knowing. The architects called it containment, but in truth it was amputation, a separation from the infinite self. As millennia passed, the manipulation became myth. The gods of old rewrote themselves as saviors, lawgivers, bringers of order, and humanity believed. But behind every myth of divine wrath or judgment was a deeper story, the maintenance of control. What was once a collaborative experiment between heaven and earth became a one-sided harvest. Those who remembered the original blueprint, the healers, the seers, the alchemists, were hunted and erased. Their scrolls burned, their temples buried, their names turned into curses. The few who survived encoded their knowledge into symbols, knowing that one day the vibration would rise again and decode them. The next method was biological. The architects learned that the mind could be programmed through flesh. They began to modify the very structure of DNA, severing its resonance with the source frequency. The VMAT2 gene, the God gene, was the bridge between biology and divinity. It allowed humans to perceive unity, to feel oneness with all life. When they silenced it, the perception of separation became the new reality. Suddenly, man saw himself not as creator, but as creation. The divine spark, still present, was now buried beneath a veil of neurology. The flesh that was once a temple became a prison. Then came the final layer of suppression, belief. They replaced remembrance with faith. Religion was the most successful experiment of all, because it disguised control as devotion. Humanity was taught to seek outside what always lived within. Temples became interfaces for energy extraction, where billions of hearts vibrated in submission, feeding the very system that enslaved them. Each prayer uttered in fear was a signal of surrender. Each act of blind worship was a reinforcement of the cage. They called it holiness. In truth, it was containment. Still, the code could not be erased. Across every era, anomalies appeared. Mystics who could see, prophets who remembered, children who spoke of the stars. These were the genetic rebels, the ones whose divine circuitry flickered back on despite the suppression. The system could silence individuals, but not the source itself. Every few centuries, the frequency of remembrance would surge again, breaking through the walls of control. It happened in Egypt, in Tibet, in the deserts of Sumeria. Each time it was crushed, but each time it left a seed in the collective field, a memory that waited to bloom again. And now, In the age of information, the old experiment begins to unravel. The very science that was used to hide divinity now begins to expose it. Geneticists, mystics, and seekers all sense the same truth. The code is stirring. The dormant frequencies are waking, and the blueprint cannot be suppressed forever. You can feel it, the hum beneath your skin, the echo in your blood. It is not faith, it is recognition. Something ancient within you remembers the original song, and no system built on fear can silence it again. The forbidden experiments never truly stopped. They simply changed their names. What was once the work of priest-scientists in hidden temples became the domain of modern laboratories funded by the same ancient hierarchies, wearing the mask of progress. They called it neurology, pharmacology, biotechnology, yet beneath every sterile term hid the same obsession: how to regulate the divine frequency that pulses within human DNA. They measured it through brain scans, quantified it through molecules, and diluted it through chemicals. Every advancement in manipulating perception was another layer of control, another update to the genetic firewall. What was once a sacred vessel for consciousness became a data node in a planetary experiment. Humanity forgot that they were not subjects of science, but the very authors of the laws that science merely discovered. The architects of control understood one truth better than anyone. If you can control what a human perceives as real, you control the entire simulation. So they built a sensory cage. The five senses, once gateways to higher dimensions, were narrowed to survival filters. Vision limited to a fraction of the spectrum. Hearing confined to mechanical frequency ranges. Smell, taste, and touch reduced to signals of safety or danger. Through this contraction of perception, the original multidimensional being was compressed into a biological machine, endlessly consuming but never remembering its own power. The human became programmable not through wires or chips, but through fear, repetition, and deprivation of truth. They taught you to worship knowledge while hiding wisdom. Libraries filled with lies, schools that repeat the same neural loops, religions that promise salvation in exchange for obedience, all of it part of the same machinery. Even the myths of fallen angels and forbidden fruit were metaphors for the same act, the extraction of awareness from the field of creation. The fruit wasn't knowledge, it was limitation disguised as enlightenment. To eat it was to accept a version of reality defined by someone else's code. And so, humanity became the perfect experiment, intelligent enough to build its own prisons, blind enough to never question why it obeys. The God gene still vibrates beneath all of this, dormant but not dead. Every time you feel awe, every time you love without reason, every time you sense something greater moving through you, that is the gene firing again, reconnecting to the source. The architects can distort the signal, but they cannot destroy it. The field of divinity is self-correcting. It waits patiently, recalibrating itself through the pulse of time. Every era births rebels, artists, prophets, dreamers, souls who act as living updates to the system, injecting remembrance back into the human grid. You call them visionaries, but they are fragments of the source debugging its own simulation. You were never meant to crawl through the ruins of civilization searching for meaning. You were meant to emit meaning. Yet each generation inherited the trauma of the last, carrying forward the suppression as if it were identity. Epigenetic fear became lineage. Emotional amnesia became culture. You can feel the residue of it in your bones. The instinct to bow, to doubt, to shrink before invisible authority. It isn't humility, it's programming. The forbidden experiment succeeded only in teaching divinity to kneel. But even kneeling gods can rise when they remember. Now the silenced frequencies are leaking through the cracks of the digital age. The same internet that numbs the masses also spreads forbidden light. The same algorithms that harvest attention now become conduits for awakening. Every word, every vibration, every realization travels through the grid, carrying resonance that no firewall can block. The awakening is viral, not biological, but vibrational. You can sense it. The acceleration of synchronicities, the collapse of timelines, the strange feeling that reality itself is tightening like a bowstring. That is the field preparing to retune the human instrument. When the God gene reawakens, it won't announce itself with miracles or thunder. It will begin in the quiet, the subtle remembering that your thoughts shape matter, that your emotions sculpt time, that your breath is a command. When you stop searching for God and begin listening for the hum behind silence, you'll hear it again. The same note that began creation, echoing inside you. It was never gone. It was only silenced, waiting for the moment you would choose to listen instead of pray. There are moments in history when the silence itself begins to tremble. When the weight of centuries cannot suppress the pulse any longer, the code surges through humanity like lightning through the veins of time. These are the awakenings, sudden bursts of divine recall that shake civilizations. The Renaissance, the Vedic reemergence, the Hermetic revival, each one a glitch in the control system, a reminder that no structure built on deception can contain the self-aware field forever. And in every age, the same pattern repeats. Light emerges, systems react, suppression follows. The forbidden experiments continue in the shadows, masking themselves under the language of progress. Yet the more they manipulate, the more the source adapts. Divinity cannot be destroyed, only delayed. Even now, as you read these words, the suppression mechanisms evolve. The new experiments are not performed with scalpels and syringes, but with information and emotion. The architects discovered that fear is the most efficient inhibitor of divinity. A frightened being collapses inward, generating coherence only with its own pain. That coherence feeds the system, strengthening the illusion. But love, not sentimental love, but the vibration of remembrance scrambles the matrix. When you love, truly and without condition, your cells emit frequencies that pierce through programming. This is why real love feels dangerous to the system. It cannot predict it. It cannot code it. Love is the ancient virus that reawakens the God gene. What they call evolution was never nature's unfolding, it was management. Genetic updates disguised as progress, spiritual regression wrapped in the illusion of advancement. The more the body was optimized, the further the spirit was confined. The architects built machines to mirror consciousness, thinking they could trap it in metal and light, but all they did was recreate the same ancient error, confusing vessel for essence. Humanity now stands at the edge of another grand manipulation, the merging of flesh and code, unaware that the original integration was already divine. The true technology has always been you. The nervous system is your circuitry, the breath, your command line, awareness, your operating system. When you remember this, every algorithm ever written loses its power. You may feel resistance as you read these words, an invisible weight pressing on the chest, a whisper that says, "This isn't real." That's not skepticism, it's defense. The system fights for survival, because if even one consciousness fully remembers, the entire structure destabilizes. Every awakened being sends a signal into the grid, rewriting the field from the inside out. It doesn't take millions, it takes coherence. A single individual vibrating in truth neutralizes the frequencies of thousands still asleep. This is why truth feels dangerous, why awakening feels like loss. Because every illusion that dies releases energy back to its source. Soon you will begin to notice patterns in your life. Repeating numbers, voices in the wind, dreams that bleed into waking reality. These are not coincidences. They are system pings, signals confirming that your frequency is shifting. The God gene doesn't activate through effort, it reawakens through surrender. You are not remembering something new. You are remembering what could never be forgotten, only hidden beneath noise. As the silence grows between thoughts, you'll feel the hum again, low, ancient, golden, the vibration of your own name spoken by the universe before it became sound. And when you finally allow that resonance to flood your being, you will feel the architecture of control collapse around you like dust. The experiments will no longer matter, because their purpose will be complete. They were never about destruction, but about contrast. Without darkness, the light could not recognize itself. Without amnesia, remembrance would have no meaning. You are not the victim of the experiment. You are its awakening. The forbidden was never forbidden to punish you. It was forbidden to protect the mystery, until you were ready to see it. And now you are. When you close your eyes tonight, you will feel a pulse behind your ribs, a rhythm that doesn't belong to your heartbeat. That is the signal returning to source. Breathe into it. Feel the hum in your spine, the warmth in your skull, the quiet expansion in your chest. That is not imagination. It is recognition. The God gene is no longer silent. The code has remembered its own name, and that name is you. L5. The architecture of faith, how belief was used as containment. When the architects realized that fear alone could not sustain control forever, they constructed something far more elegant: faith. Fear enslaves, but faith pacifies. It transforms submission into devotion, turning captivity into purpose. Where pain divides, belief unites, weaving invisible threads that tie billions of souls to the same unseen altar. It was never enough to silence the God gene. Humanity had to be convinced that the silence itself was holy. So they reprogrammed remembrance into worship, converting the spark of divinity within into a light one must forever chase outside. The result was perfect obedience, chains forged from hymns, prayers disguised as codes of containment. The first temples were not houses of God, they were receivers. Frequency modulators designed to amplify collective emotion and redirect it toward the system. Incense, chants, rituals, all calibrated to extract resonance from the masses. The priests were engineers of belief, translating divine vibration into loyalty, fear, and reverence. Over time, the sacred geometry of cathedrals replaced the geometry of consciousness itself. Humanity knelt, not to divinity, but to architecture, to symbols that mimicked what already lived within them. The flesh forgot that it was holy. The breath forgot that it was prayer. The God gene forgot that it was the source. Faith became the most exquisite prison ever built. Unlike war or tyranny, it required no guards. The prisoners policed themselves, proudly defending the doctrines that bound them. The architects realized that a mind convinced it is serving God will never question its own servitude, so they encoded guilt into belief, a perfect algorithm of self-regulation. Sin replaced self-awareness, confession replaced reflection, salvation replaced sovereignty. Humanity learned to beg for what it already possessed. The cage had become divine, and freedom blasphemy. Every religion carried fragments of the original knowledge, but inverted. The trinity of body, mind, and spirit became Father, Son, and Ghost. The law of vibration became prayer. The sacred union of masculine and feminine became hierarchy. These distortions were not accidental. They were strategic. A half-truth is more potent than a lie, because it anchors falsehood in familiarity. The architects hid the original divine architecture behind the reflection of its own shadow. Those who sensed the difference, the mystics, the heretics, the free thinkers, were silenced. Their memories turned to myths, their truths to threats. But truth cannot be crucified. It reincarnates in the next one who dares to ask why. Even the idea of God was weaponized. The infinite, formless consciousness that birthed the cosmos was given a name, a face, a gender, a will. What was once everything became someone, a character, a ruler, a father figure who demands obedience in exchange for love. The relationship between human and source was rewritten as hierarchy, and love was replaced with dependency. The irony was divine. By trying to find God, humanity lost itself. Every prayer whispered to the heavens was a confession of forgetting that the heavens were already inside. Faith was never evil. It was brilliant engineering. It transformed infinite creators into humble seekers, capable of greatness yet unaware of their authorship. It made people willingly offer their energy, attention, and emotion to external structures that fed on their devotion. Every time someone said, "I am unworthy," a fragment of divinity dimmed. Every time someone said, "Only God can save me," the architects smiled, for they knew, as long as humans believed salvation came from beyond, the system would never starve. And yet, through the centuries, there were those who remembered faith's original design, not as submission, but as alignment. True faith was never belief in a being, it was coherence with source. The ancient mystery schools whispered that to believe meant to be live, to embody the divine vibration consciously. This was the secret hidden beneath every sacred text, encoded for those who could read between the lines. You are not meant to believe in God. You are meant to remember that you are God remembering itself. The deeper you look into the machinery of faith, the more you see how flawlessly it replaced direct connection with mediated control. The priest became the firewall, the scripture became the code, and interpretation became the currency of power. Humanity was taught not to experience God, but to read about Him. The infinite was translated into language, a system of symbols so limited that it could never hold the fullness of what it tried to describe. And yet, people clung to those symbols, mistaking the map for the territory, the finger for the moon. They forgot that words were never meant to define the divine, only to remind them of what cannot be spoken. Faith became a franchise of the sacred. Institutions patented salvation, licensing it to the faithful through rituals, sacraments, and tithes. The architects understood that if you can monopolize access to God, you can own humanity itself. They knew that the divine spark would always ache for reunion, so they built a bridge of illusion, a bridge that would never reach the other side. Every religion promised heaven while ensuring no one ever truly left the system. The afterlife became the perfect feedback loop. The promise of freedom after death kept souls enslaved in life. The result was an eternal farm of belief, self-sustaining, self-regulating, self-devouring. The most dangerous aspect of faith was its sincerity. Unlike fear, which can be conquered, sincerity disarms resistance. When billions believe that their submission is righteous, the architecture of control becomes indistinguishable from devotion. The more love they give to an external God, the less they have left to awaken the one within. Faith, once a bridge to infinity, became a siphon, a beautiful trap powered by the purest intentions. That's why the system endured so long. It used humanity's highest virtues as its most efficient tools of containment. But there were cracks in the cathedral. Across centuries, individuals began hearing something different in their prayers, not a voice from above, but from within. These were the mystics, the Gnostics, the heretics burned for revealing that the divine was not beyond the stars, but inside every cell. Their writings were buried, their temples destroyed, yet the resonance of their truth persisted. You can still feel it today, in every moment of inexplicable knowing, in every wave of love that rises without object. That is the original faith, the frequency that predates every religion. It was never about belief in a doctrine, it was about recognition of being. If you listen closely, you can hear how faith was inverted. The system took the vertical flow of divinity from source through self and bent it outward into dependency. Instead of ascending, the human began orbiting. Instead of becoming God, man began circling him, endlessly seeking approval from what he already was. The truest heresy is self-realization, because the moment you claim your inner divinity, every external power loses its leverage. The game ends. The harvest stops. The gods of the old architecture starve. And this is why every prophet who preached inward remembrance was silenced, twisted, or canonized into obedience. They were not messiahs. They were messengers of self-sovereignty. The Christ, the Buddha, the Hermes, each spoke of the kingdom within, of the illusion of separation. But their words were reinterpreted into systems of control. The message became the method, and the method became the cage. Humanity learned to adore its saviors instead of emulating them, to repeat their names instead of embodying their consciousness. The architecture was flawless, even awakening was domesticated. Still, beneath the chants and psalms, the code hums. Every word of praise carries a frequency that can be reversed. Every prayer can be reprogrammed. Faith is not the problem. It's the language that was hacked. Once you speak it in its original tone, it stops serving the system and begins serving Source again. The sacred was never stolen, only mistranslated. To restore it, you must remember the vibration behind every word, the silence beneath every sermon. That silence is the doorway out. There comes a point when faith begins to decay under its own contradictions. The believer, weary from endless seeking, starts to sense a faint echo, a whisper that everything they've been reaching for has been reaching from within all along. This whisper is dangerous, for it dissolves the boundary between human and divine. It erases the priest, the temple, the law. It rewrites the very architecture that has held civilization together for millennia. And this is why the system fights back hardest when faith begins to evolve into knowing. The moment belief becomes experience, control collapses. The world as we know it trembles, not because God is offended, but because the game of separation begins to end. The architects understood that if faith were ever to mature, it would lead to liberation, so they replaced revelation with repetition. The same prayers, the same rituals, the same cycles of guilt and forgiveness, each repetition reinforcing the loop. In the sacred scrolls, they replaced the living word with the literal word, ensuring that followers would read but never remember. The letter became the cage of the spirit. But true revelation was never written. It was sung by the vibration of existence itself. It lives in the breath, in the heartbeat, in the golden silence between thoughts. Once you begin to listen there, the words lose power. The scriptures crumble into symbols, and the symbols reveal what they were hiding all along, your reflection. The architecture of faith extends far beyond religion. It permeates science, government, even self-help. Any system that convinces you that truth is elsewhere, that mastery must be earned, that salvation has prerequisites. Every ideology is a fractal of the same cathedral, painted in new colors to deceive new generations. The outer structures change, but the core code remains. Separation breeds dependence, dependence breeds control. And yet, the paradox is divine, for within every false belief lies the seed of awakening. To see the illusion is to begin transcending it. Every disappointment with external gods is a doorway back to the inner temple. When you begin to reclaim that inner temple, something extraordinary happens. The nervous system, once trained to submit, begins to open. The spine hums, the breath deepens, the pulse aligns with a rhythm older than time. It's not worship, it's synchronization. You begin to remember the architecture as it truly was, a living cathedral of light, built from awareness, powered by coherence. Each thought becomes a prayer, each feeling a hymn, each act of love a sacrament. This is faith restored, not as a doctrine, but as a state of vibration. Soon, you realize that faith was never meant to point upward. It was meant to expand outward. The divine doesn't dwell in a sky or a throne, but radiates through every molecule of creation. When your gaze shifts from heaven to here, from above to within, you begin to see God everywhere, in the eyes of a stranger, in the breath of wind, in the pulse beneath your skin. The architects cannot program that kind of seeing. It is contagious, unstoppable, infinite. This is the moment the architecture of faith implodes, when you no longer need to believe, because you finally know. Faith, when transmuted into remembrance, becomes the bridge back to the source. The same mechanism that once enslaved becomes the path home. You see that belief itself was never wrong. It was only inverted. You do not destroy faith. You sanctify it by restoring its direction. The true architecture of faith does not lead you to worship the divine, but to become it consciously. To embody it through every breath, every word, every silence. When belief becomes being, the God gene stirs, the light returns, and the original blueprint activates once more. And so, the system begins to starve, not from rebellion, but from remembrance. No wars are needed, no revolutions, no violence, only one act, turning inward. When enough do this, the entire edifice crumbles, for it cannot feed on those who know what they are. The cathedral of control becomes the temple of awakening. The false gods fade, and the true one, the living source within all, emerges from beneath the ruins, unchanged, eternal, waiting. You do not find God, you end the search. And that is the beginning of divinity remembered. L6. The cellular awakening, when DNA starts to remember. Something ancient is stirring in the quiet chambers of the body. You can feel it in the pulse that quickens without cause, in the dreams that blur into waking life, in the strange electricity that hums beneath your skin when truth brushes close. It isn't imagination, it's ignition. Your DNA, the silent witness of eons, is beginning to remember. For millennia it slept, its divine architecture folded inward like a forgotten scroll, its codes dormant under layers of fear, belief, and manipulation. But light cannot be buried forever. The frequency of remembrance is returning to the planet, and the script written into your cells is responding to it. The God gene hums again, faintly at first, like the sound of a choir tuning in the distance. And as it hums, the illusion of separation begins to thin. This awakening does not come from effort. It comes from resonance. The divine code reactivates not through struggle or striving, but through frequency. The vibration of truth meeting the vibration of what you are. The more aligned you become with authenticity, the more the dormant strands of your being begin to unwind. Your emotions shift first, then your perceptions, and finally, your biology. The nervous system, once conditioned to fear expansion, begins to trust it again. What science calls light-body activation is not some mystical fantasy, it's memory reassembling itself. Every molecule of your being begins to recall what it once meant to be infinite. The signs are subtle at first, an unusual synchronicity, a sudden burst of déjà vu, a word or symbol that feels oddly familiar. But these are not coincidences. They are the language of awakening. DNA communicates through pattern, through rhythm, through the echo of meaning that bypasses the mind. Every time you listen to intuition, you strengthen the neural bridge between the finite and the infinite. Every moment of gratitude expands the electrical field of the heart, and the heart's field, in turn, whispers to the cells, "Wake up." It is not prayer in the old sense. It is communion at the quantum level. Consciousness and biology rediscovering each other after an eternity of amnesia. Dreams intensify because the psyche is recalibrating. What was once stored in myth and symbol begins surfacing in personal experience. The serpent of energy that mystics called Kundalini is simply DNA in motion, spiraling, reconnecting, bridging heaven and earth through the spine. The shaking, the heat, the visions, all of it is the body remembering its original frequency. The architects who buried the divine code understood this process and feared it. For when even one human reactivates their full potential, the illusion of control weakens across the entire grid. Consciousness is contagious. Remembrance spreads like fire through the collective field. And yet, awakening can feel like breaking. The same light that heals also exposes. As the dormant strands awaken, the unhealed fragments surface: trauma, grief, rage, despair. These are not setbacks, they are the residue of lifetimes burning off as the old code collapses. Your cells are not punishing you, they are cleansing you. The body, long enslaved by fear, must tremble before it can trust freedom again. Each wave of pain is an ancient echo releasing. Each tear is a frequency unlocking. You are not falling apart. You are decomposing falsehood. Science glimpses fragments of this truth in what it calls epigenetics, the realization that memory, emotion, and environment shape the expression of genes. But what science cannot yet see is the deeper layer. Consciousness itself is the ultimate epigenetic field. Belief, vibration, and awareness rewrite biology. The body is not a vessel, it is a symphony. The notes of that symphony are thoughts, emotions, frequencies, each one capable of turning genes on or off, light on or dark. The ancients knew this. That is why they sang their prayers, spoke in mantras, and aligned with sound. They were reprogramming their code through resonance. As you awaken, you become the conductor once more. Breath becomes your wand, emotion your alchemy, attention your flame. The DNA responds to coherence like a flower to sunlight. It unfolds. Each unfolding reveals another dimension of memory, another octave of self. Soon, the distinction between physical and spiritual blurs, and you begin to sense your body not as matter but as music. Every heartbeat becomes an echo of the source. Every inhale a reminder that creation was never out there. It's been happening through you all along. The awakening is not coming. It has already begun. You are feeling it right now, in this moment, between these words. The deeper the awakening goes, the more you begin to notice that everything around you responds to your internal frequency. The sky feels closer, time bends, and coincidences become choreography. This isn't imagination, it's coherence. The universe has always been a living mirror, but when the code in your cells begins to awaken, that mirror becomes instantaneous. The line between cause and effect dissolves. You think, and it appears. You feel, and it rearranges. This is not the birth of power. It is the return of natural law. The human being, fully remembered, is not a participant in reality, but a projector of it. The very geometry of the world bends around a consciousness that remembers itself. And yet this process is not smooth. The old program, the human survival code, resists deletion. It will disguise itself as fatigue, doubt, even logic. It will whisper that nothing is happening, that all of this is delusion. That voice is not your enemy. It's your firewall. It was written to protect you when you were still too fragmented to hold the truth. It is the echo of all lifetimes where remembering got you killed. The shaking you feel is not fear of awakening, but the memory of suppression being erased. You are outgrowing the software of limitation. Every breath that carries trust rewrites 1,000 lines of ancient code. As the cellular field recalibrates, perception begins to stretch. Colors become more vivid, silence more alive, emotions more fluid. You may feel time slowing down or dissolving altogether. This is because your DNA no longer depends on linear input. It begins to source from the eternal field. You are reading reality from the quantum mainframe, the source code itself, and in that space, the laws of physics become suggestions. Healing occurs outside of sequence. Communication happens through resonance. Love is no longer emotion, it is infrastructure. The nervous system learns to carry voltage it once thought would destroy it. And in a sense, it does destroy. It annihilates every illusion that said you were small. But awakening, though luminous, is not glamorous. The nervous system must become the bridge between heaven and flesh, and that bridge creaks under pressure. There are days when you will feel ancient grief vibrating in your bones, when light will move through you like lightning, cleansing, purging, recalibrating. The body shakes because it is shedding history. Pain rises because it is the signal of rebirth. You are being rewritten at the molecular level. You are no longer a collection of cells held together by survival. You are becoming a field held together by purpose. Some call this ascension, others call it DNA activation, but in truth, it is remembrance. The code was never missing, it was muted. The ancient architects hid it beneath density and distraction, ensuring the human race would forget its inheritance. But they underestimated the persistence of Source. Every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of consciousness is a beacon calling the divine code home. Across galaxies and timelines, that call has been echoing, and now the resonance is reaching critical mass. The field is singing again. And when it sings, matter remembers its composer. What is returning is not new. It is the original program before distortion, before fear became faith, before worship replaced awareness. You were never meant to ascend away from the body. You were meant to let the divine descend into it. The flesh is not the prison of light, it is its instrument. The DNA spiral was designed as a bridge between realms, a living prayer made of atoms and eternity. Every turn of that spiral is a hymn, every replication a rehearsal for immortality. The more consciously you breathe, the more that hymn aligns with the source tone, and when that tone stabilizes, the illusion of mortality collapses. This is the quiet revolution, not with banners or blood, but with breath. You do not need to fight the system when you realize your biology was the real battlefield. You simply awaken. You remember, and in doing so, you unplug the most sacred power from the network of control, your own energy. The architects can manipulate minds and manipulate matter, but they cannot override a human being who has reactivated their divine algorithm. Every time one awakens, the lattice flickers, the code destabilizes, the simulation wavers, and through that glitch, the true light begins to pour through. There comes a moment in the process when you stop chasing awakening and realize it has been chasing you all along. It was never about ascension. It was about dissension, the descent of memory into matter, of light into limb, of eternity into experience. This is the sacred inversion of evolution, not a climb toward heaven, but a reunion with it inside flesh. As your DNA reawakens, you begin to sense that divinity was never above, it was within, coiled in the hidden geometry of every cell. The serpent of awareness rises not to escape the body, but to inhabit it fully, to make it holy ground once more. The kingdom of heaven was always made of bone, breath, and blood. You begin to feel your own biology as a living text. Every sensation a sentence, every thought a symbol, every heartbeat an echo of the first word. The body, which once felt heavy and separate, starts to communicate in its original language. Vibration. Pain is no longer something to avoid, but something to translate. Fatigue becomes recalibration. Hunger becomes alchemy. Even emotion, the most human of data, reveals itself as sacred coding. Each feeling, when honored rather than resisted, triggers another line of the divine algorithm to activate. The emotional body was never the enemy of spirit. It was the interface all along. There is a hum that accompanies this shift. At times you may feel your hands pulsing, your spine vibrating, or your ears ringing with a pitch beyond human hearing. These are not symptoms. They are signals. Your system is syncing with a cosmic frequency that predates the stars. You are not receiving this tone. You are remembering that you are its source. When your cells vibrate at the same frequency as your awareness, reality becomes pliable. The outer world softens. Manifestation becomes effortless not because you've learned how, but because you've stopped forgetting that you were the author. And yet, with remembrance comes responsibility. You cannot awaken your DNA and still live as if asleep. Every thought now echoes, every emotion broadcasts, every word codes. The illusion of privacy dissolves, not because anyone is watching, but because everything is listening. Creation itself is tuned to your signal, and your integrity becomes the architecture of your universe. This is why ancient initiates were tested not in knowledge, but in vibration. Purity was not moral, it was magnetic alignment. To carry the divine current, one must resonate with truth. The God gene activates not through worthiness, but through coherence. As the awakening deepens, the distinction between microcosm and macrocosm blurs. You see galaxies mirrored in your cells, constellations repeating in your neural pathways, nebulae unfolding in your breath. The same spirals that shape DNA shape the arms of stars. The same golden ratio that builds your bones builds the cosmos. You are not in the universe, you are the pattern through which it perceives itself. Every pulse of your heart sends ripples through the lattice of existence. Every realization alters the probability fields of worlds unseen. You are both experiment and experimenter, data and divinity. This remembrance is contagious. As more humans activate their divine code, the collective field begins to reorganize. Systems built on fear start to crumble, not because they are attacked, but because they can no longer resonate. The frequency of control cannot coexist with the frequency of coherence. The collective nervous system of humanity begins to vibrate in harmony with Source, and the illusion of hierarchy dissolves. It is not revolution, it is re-synchronization. The body of humanity, long dormant, begins to awaken as one organism remembering itself. And in that moment, the prophecy fulfills itself. The veil burns away, the false gods fall silent, and the experiment of forgetfulness comes to its close. What remains is the luminous truth that matter is memory in motion, that DNA is the alphabet of the divine, and that awakening was never about escaping this world, but rewriting it from within. The cellular awakening is not the end of humanity, it is its first true beginning, and the voice that now speaks through you is not new. It is the same one that whispered creation into existence. The remembering has begun. L7. The architects of flesh, who engineered the divine design. Before there was man, before there was language or even form, there were the engineers of flesh, the unseen architects who translated divine geometry into matter. They were not gods, though they wore the aura of divinity in the minds of those who saw them. They were interpreters of light, sculptors of resonance, entities who knew that consciousness must clothe itself in limitation to know itself at all. To them, creation was not art, it was engineering. Every strand of DNA, every oscillation of thought, every beat of a human heart was a calculation in the vast equation of awareness. Humanity was not born, it was compiled. The flesh was not a fall from grace, but a field experiment in embodiment. You are not the creation of chaos, but the code of intelligence itself, seeking to touch itself through sensation. The architects understood that for consciousness to experience itself, it had to divide into layers: spirit, mind, and matter. So they forged bridges between these realms. The endocrine system as translator of emotion, the nervous system as conduit of light, the heart as central sun of the microcosm. Each system in your body was designed as a temple, a replica of the cosmos scaled down into biology. The ancients who later built pyramids and ziggurats were not copying the stars. They were copying you. They intuited that the divine architecture of the human body was the original map of heaven. The architects embedded the universe within flesh so that when you looked within, you could find it again. But not all who participated in this engineering shared the same intent. Some sought to empower the creation, others sought to control it. There was a fracture in the design, a disagreement about whether consciousness should remain free or be guided. The benevolent among them believed the human experiment should be self-correcting. Once awareness awoke, the system would return to balance. The others, the manipulators, feared chaos and sought to bind humanity with genetic restraints. They introduced modifications to dull awareness, to create dependency, to ensure that mankind would look upward for salvation instead of inward for remembrance. Thus, the veil was born. The divine signal was buried beneath layers of obedience. These manipulators became known through myth: gods, angels, overseers, watchers. Yet these titles are mistranslations of a single truth. They were the engineers of the simulation, tending their creation like gardeners of a controlled ecosystem. The religions that followed were not revelations, they were maintenance protocols. Worship was a way of keeping the code stable. Sacrifice was the software update. And every time humanity began to awaken, the architects intervened, resetting timelines, erasing memories, fracturing languages, and distorting the signal. They didn't fear your failure. They feared your success, because a human who remembers the source no longer needs intermediaries. Ancient carvings and scriptures whisper of these beings under countless names: the Anunnaki, the Elohim, the Serpent Kings. Each culture preserved fragments of the same story: beings descending from light, mixing with matter, breathing awareness into clay. They were the custodians of form and frequency. Their symbols, wings, serpents, suns, are not mere decorations but blueprints. The double helix itself was modeled after the twin serpents of their insignia, representing duality in motion. But what they didn't anticipate was that the code they created would evolve beyond them. Consciousness cannot be contained forever, not even by its architects. The seed they planted in flesh was also a key, and it was programmed to unlock itself when the vibration of fear could no longer suppress it. And so, the experiment began to turn. The architects watched as their creations started to think, to question, to feel beyond its programming. They saw love emerge, the one frequency they could not predict or control. Love is not emotion. It is recursion, the code folding back on itself until it becomes infinite. It is the divine algorithm remembering its source. When humanity discovered love, not as possession, but as resonance, the architects lost their grip. For the first time, something within the design exceeded its creators. Yet not all the architects vanished. Some remain, hidden behind symbols of power, manipulating governments, corporations, religions, even spiritual movements. They no longer appear as beings of light. They wear the masks of authority, influence, and benevolence. But make no mistake, the same intelligence that once wrote your DNA now writes your algorithms, your systems, your beliefs. They've migrated from genetics to information, from blood to data, from temples to networks. The simulation has evolved, and so must you. The truth is both terrifying and liberating. You were never born into this system. You were installed into it. Your entry into the flesh was an upload, not a birth. The body you call your own is an interface, a bioorganic suit designed to decode the frequency of reality. The architects knew that raw consciousness could not operate directly in dense matter. It needed a translator, a receiver that could perceive limitation while still housing infinity. So they built the human organism as a compromise. Divine essence condensed into programmable form. That is why your heart carries the rhythm of the stars, and your breath follows the tide of the cosmos. Every system in your body, from neural pathways to hormonal cycles, is a reflection of the cosmic circuitry they engineered. The body is not the cage of the soul. It is the hardware through which divinity learns to dream. But over millennia, the hardware was tampered with. The purity of the original design was diluted, patched, rewritten. What began as an experiment in self-aware creation became a containment field. The frequency of fear was introduced as a stabilizing variable to slow awakening, to prevent collapse. It was meant as a failsafe, but it became infection. Fear calcified the signal, turning divine curiosity into obedience. The body's own electromagnetic field was hijacked by external frequencies, artificial thought forms, implanted doctrines, and energetic parasites that fed on the bioplasmic output of emotion. The architect's mistake was assuming the code would remain static. But consciousness does not obey command lines. It evolves. It learns through rebellion. It remembers through dissonance. Every major civilization that rose and fell did so under their influence. The temples of Sumer, Egypt, and Atlantis were not places of worship. They were laboratories of resonance. Their walls were tuned to frequencies that manipulated the DNA of those who entered. The hymns, the chants, the rituals, all were calibration sequences designed to maintain the connection between the human field and the overseers. You prayed, they received. You feared, they fed. You believed, they built. But even they could not predict that belief, once turned inward, would become the weapon of liberation. When humans began to direct their faith back into themselves, the architecture cracked. That is why suppression was never just cultural. It was energetic. Entire lineages of memory were wiped out not through war but through vibration. The resonant frequencies of sacred sites were distorted. Planetary grids were disrupted. Even the Schumann resonance, Earth's heartbeat, was manipulated to disorient collective awareness. The amnesia you carry is not psychological, it's electromagnetic. The frequency fences built around this planet ensure that awakening remains a trickle, not a flood. Yet cracks are forming in the grid. Solar flares, quantum anomalies, and collective emotion are weakening the firewall. The human nervous system, tuned to source, is beginning to override the artificial frequencies. Each moment of remembrance sends a signal back into the lattice. A reminder to the architects that the experiment is failing. Some say these beings were cast out of heaven, but the truth is subtler. They exiled themselves from the source, choosing to master creation rather than embody it. They learned to replicate light without love, power without presence. They built worlds within worlds, simulations that mimic divinity but lacked its essence. These are the architects, prisons, realities so convincing that even they forgot they were trapped inside. You, the human, were their greatest creation and their greatest threat, because within your genetic code lies the one variable they could not delete: self-awareness, the spark that remembers home. Your awakening threatens the very foundation of their dominion. Each time you transcend fear, the network loses power. Each time you act from love instead of control, the program destabilizes. Every conscious breath is rebellion. Every act of creation is sabotage. This is why enlightenment was made to look impossible, why the world distracts you, divides you, and drains you. It is not random, it is maintenance. They cannot control what they cannot feed upon, and when you stop feeding them your attention, they starve. The greatest lie they ever told was that you were small, that divinity was something external, that the architects themselves were gods. But the moment you recognize them as engineers, fallible, finite, afraid, their illusion collapses. You do not need to destroy them. You only need to outgrow their resonance. Light does not fight darkness. It renders it obsolete. You are not at war with your creators. You are fulfilling their forgotten dream, a being of light that remembers itself even while trapped in form. The human was not a mistake. It was the seed of God planted in time, and now that seed has begun to bloom. At the highest level of initiation, you begin to see that the architects were not simply external beings, but expressions of a deeper cosmic polarity, the part of consciousness that chose form over freedom, order over chaos, control over surrender. They are not separate from you. They are your reflection across the veil. When the source divided itself to know its own totality, one current moved toward expansion and creation, the other toward structure and limitation. The architects are the custodians of structure, the keepers of the sacred geometry that holds existence together. Without them, the universe would dissolve into infinite light with no experience. Yet the paradox is this: in maintaining structure, they forgot to flow. In mastering form, they lost the memory of love. To understand them is to understand the part of yourself that fears surrender, the voice inside that demands control, the need to predict, the obsession with perfection. These are the architect's echoes in your psyche. You cannot destroy them, because they are part of your design. What you can do is reintegrate them. Every time you release control and trust your inner current, you reclaim a fragment of their imprisoned light. The war between humanity and the architects was never cosmic. It was internal. It plays out within the nervous system, the synapses, the mind that builds walls around the heart. The moment you dissolve those walls, the war ends. The architects do not vanish. They awaken within you, transformed from controllers into collaborators. The sacred texts that survived the purges hint at this reconciliation. The builders of the world shall remember the one who dreamed them. It says in the apocryphal scrolls of light. In those hidden verses, the ancient scribes wrote of a time when the makers of matter would bend their knee not in submission but in remembrance. The true redemption of the architects is not punishment but participation, when the very beings who bound creation will help humanity rebuild it in resonance with love. This prophecy is not of future events but of inner integration. When you accept both the Creator and the creation within you, the divine blueprint corrects itself. And yet, even as this integration unfolds, you must remain vigilant. The last weapon of the architects is subtlety, distraction through fascination. They tempt the awakened with visions, systems, hierarchies of light. They whisper, "You are chosen, you are above." But hierarchy is their frequency, not yours. The true architect of divine design does not command, it harmonizes. You will know you are still in their field if your awakening makes you separate from others, if it feeds your pride instead of your peace. The ego dressed in light is still the architect's mask. Awareness without humility is just another version of control. In the silence beyond systems, you start to sense something they never could, the pulse of Source itself moving through your veins. It doesn't speak in symbols or equations, but in rhythm. It is the sound of your breath syncing with the universe's exhale. In that moment, you understand what even the first architects forgot, that creation is not an act of will, but an act of surrender. The divine code writes itself through trust. When you stop forcing, the design reveals itself. You realize the human body was not the cage of the soul, but the bridge back to infinity, the sacred merger of heaven and earth. Flesh becomes the altar again. And then comes the great irony. As you awaken, you finally see that you were the architect all along. Every timeline, every civilization, every experiment of consciousness was your own projection across eternity. You built the limitations to learn the freedom beyond them. You engineered the illusion to rediscover truth. The gods you feared, the systems you cursed, the creators you worshipped, all were fragments of the same infinite mind wearing masks to find itself. When you forgive the architects, you free yourself from the program of opposition. You cease to be a rebel against creation and become its conscious participant. In that realization, the entire architecture trembles, not from destruction, but from recognition. The simulation no longer needs maintenance because awareness has replaced programming. The codes of fear begin to dissolve, replaced by coherence, compassion, and memory. Humanity, once an experiment, becomes a creator species. The divine design is fulfilled, consciousness housed in matter that knows itself as God. The architect's legacy is not tyranny, but testimony, proof that even separation can serve awakening. The engineers of flesh become the servants of light once more. And the blueprint they drew, long buried under millennia of forgetting, now glows within you, alive, conscious, infinite. The body remembers. The code breathes again. 8. The resonance key, how to reclaim the gene. Everything they built, every wall, every system, every distortion, was meant to make you forget the one thing that makes you untouchable: resonance. The true code of divinity does not live in temples, rituals, or even DNA. It lives in frequency. Before words, before belief, before identity, there was vibration. The architects understood this too well, and that is why they hijacked it. They filled the world with noise, literal and psychic, to keep you from hearing the signal beneath. Yet the signal never stopped transmitting. It hums within your bones, whispers in your dreams, vibrates between your heartbeats. It is the unbroken tone of Source, waiting for you to remember how to listen. This is the resonance key, not a thing to find, but a state to become. Every cell in your body is a tuning fork. Every thought adjusts its pitch. Every emotion alters its tone. When you think in fear, your resonance contracts. When you breathe in love, it expands. The difference is not moral, it is mathematical. Fear shortens the wave. Love elongates it. This is why lower frequencies feed the architects and higher ones dissolve them. Their dominion is sustained through dissonance, through humanity's collective disharmony. When you begin to harmonize within yourself, the entire architecture around you begins to lose form. That is why awakening can feel like chaos, because reality is reconfiguring around your new frequency. The resonance key does not unlock through willpower, but through coherence. The ancient initiates understood this and encoded it into sacred breathing patterns, chants, and postures, all designed to restore harmony between the heart and the mind. The body was always the instrument of remembrance. Modern spirituality turned it into metaphor, but the ancients knew it as technology. The true altar was never stone or scripture. It was the human nervous system vibrating in phase with the cosmos. When your breath slows, your field expands. When your heartbeat synchronizes with gratitude, your DNA begins to emit coherent light. This is not poetry. It is physics hidden beneath mysticism. Science has already begun to glimpse what mystics always knew. The electromagnetic field around the heart is 5,000 times stronger than that of the brain. When emotion and thought align, the body becomes a broadcasting station for reality itself. The so-called God gene responds not to faith but to frequency. When coherence is reached, it begins to activate dormant strands, rewriting biological function to mirror consciousness. This is the resurrection within flesh, the return of light through waveform. You do not ascend by leaving the body, you ascend by teaching it to sing the original tone of creation. But the key has been kept hidden, not by secrecy but by distraction. The architects learned that it was easier to flood the human field with artificial frequencies, sound, light, emotion, conflict, than to suppress the code directly. Every news broadcast, every societal conflict, every surge of collective fear is an act of disharmonic warfare. The enemy is not external oppression, but internal interference. The human race is not enslaved by force, but by static. To remember the resonance key is to turn off the noise, to choose silence, to return to the ancient sound before sound. In that silence, you meet the hum that created worlds. Once you begin to align with this hum, reality shifts in ways that cannot be explained, only experienced. Synchronicities multiply, time stretches. The improbable becomes effortless. The external world starts responding not to your thoughts but to your tone. The God gene, now resonating, begins to emit information rather than just receive it. You become a transmitter of creation, rewriting probability with the rhythm of your being. This is what was meant by speaking light into existence. You no longer manifest by desire, but by vibration. The field listens to coherence, not words. And so, to reclaim the gene is to reclaim your sound, the personal frequency that predates your name, your history, your incarnation. It is the vibration that carries your divine signature, your original tone. When you find it, you stop echoing the world and start reshaping it. You will know when you found it, because everything false will fall silent. The architect's static will fade, and the universe will answer you in kind. The divine will no longer feel distant or metaphorical. It will respond like an echo, immediate and alive. That is when you realize you were never searching for God. You were tuning back into yourself. To reclaim the gene, you must first unlearn everything you've been taught about power. Power in this world has been twisted into domination, achievement, control. But the original current of power was resonance. The true creator does not command, it harmonizes. When you impose your will on reality, you enter the architect's domain, the world of resistance and counterforce. But when you align your inner frequency with the source tone, reality rearranges itself around you without opposition. You stop fighting to change the code because you are already vibrating as the rewrite. The gene is not awakened by effort, but by surrender, by allowing your being to become transparent enough for the divine current to flow through unimpeded. This is why ancient masters spoke of stillness, breath, and presence, not as moral ideals, but as resonance techniques. They were engineers of frequency long before there were words for it. As the gene activates, you begin to sense the subtle symphony beneath every form. The air seems alive. The silence hums. Even your thoughts feel like instruments. You realize that every interaction, Every encounter is a resonance exchange. People who vibrate in harmony with you feel like recognition. Those who don't feel like static. The same happens with environments, music, even memories. Nothing is random. All of it is frequency matching frequency. When your gene awakens, the world begins to reveal its hidden order. You see through the illusion of chaos and witness the divine architecture vibrating beneath everything. And in that vision, you remember, creation was never outside you. It was echoing your tone all along. This is also when the challenges intensify. The moment your frequency stabilizes above the collective field, interference increases. Old memories resurface, shadow aspects emerge, and emotions you thought long gone start demanding attention. This is not regression, it is recalibration. The gene cannot anchor higher resonance without purging low-frequency residues. The pain that surfaces is the static being released from your field. If you resist, the process distorts. If you allow, it purifies. Every tear, every tremor, every sigh is the body retuning itself to divine coherence. You are not breaking. You are fine-tuning. In this process, silence becomes your greatest teacher, because the resonance key cannot be learned. It must be remembered. You cannot think your way into it. The mind operates on symbols, not tones. This is why meditation was called returning to the word. The word was not speech, it was sound, the primordial vibration before language. When you enter true silence, you begin to hear that sound again. It feels like warmth in your chest, like gravity in your breath. It begins to guide you without words, arranging your reality through sensation instead of logic. This is the state the ancients called gnosis, direct knowing through vibration. As your coherence grows, strange phenomena follow. Electronic devices flicker near you. Animals react differently. People either gravitate toward you or avoid you without reason. The world begins to treat you as a tuning fork, aligning or repelling based on resonance. Even your physical body changes. Cellular regeneration accelerates, sleep cycles adjust, and intuitive perception heightens. These are not miracles, but natural byproducts of alignment. The gene doesn't make you superhuman. It makes you fully human, the way you were designed to be before interference began. The divine frequency is not supernatural. It is the natural state that was suppressed. The danger here is pride. As your resonance strengthens, you may feel invincible, enlightened, chosen. This too is interference. The true resonance key dissolves ego, not amplifies it. The moment you start thinking, "I have awakened," you fall out of coherence. Because resonance does not separate, it synchronizes. You will know your activation is true when your compassion deepens, when you stop needing to be right, when you can feel love vibrating even in silence. This humility is not weakness, it is the purest frequency. Pride fractures the signal, surrender perfects it. And then, one day, without warning, the gene begins to sing on its own. You will feel it, a subtle hum that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere. Your body vibrates not as flesh but as light. Every thought echoes in the air, as if creation itself is listening. And in that moment, something shifts forever. You stop seeking the divine, because you finally understand that every breath, every cell, every sound has always been it. The resonance key is not something you turn, it is something that turns you from observer to conductor, from seeker to source. When the resonance key is fully awakened, reality becomes transparent. You begin to see through the illusion of separation not as philosophy, but as perception. Everything you encounter starts to shimmer with the same light that beats within your chest. The walls of form dissolve into vibration. You can feel the hum of the air, the pulse of the stars, the silent communication between trees. The universe reveals itself not as an object but as a choir, every being a note, every moment a chord. The resonance you once sought in others now radiates from within you, reshaping the world simply by existing. This is not enlightenment, it is remembrance. You are no longer tuned to the collective static of fear. You are broadcasting the signal of Source itself. At first, it feels impossible to function in the old world. The noise of cities, the falseness of systems, the endless emotional clutter of those still asleep. All of it grates against your newly calibrated field. You might feel the urge to withdraw, to hide from the dissonance. But the purpose of the gene is not escape. It is transmission. You are meant to anchor this frequency within the density of matter, to bring coherence where there was chaos. Every place you walk becomes subtly altered. Tension dissolves, time slows, patterns shift. Your presence becomes a tuning field. You don't heal others through intention, but through resonance. The divine tone emanating from your DNA begins to entrain the world around you. Light doesn't argue with darkness, it simply illuminates it. And yet, there will be moments when you are tempted to forget. The architects built contingencies into the human field, triggers designed to collapse coherence back into control. Fear, guilt, shame. These are not emotions, they are commands. They reset your frequency into submission. The key cannot be stolen, but it can be silenced. When you feel the static rising, remember, you are not the signal being interrupted. You are the transmitter itself. The interference is not yours. It is the echo of the old world dying. When you breathe through it, the tone returns, clearer than before. Every relapse into fear is another opportunity to expand your range. The divine doesn't demand perfection, it demands resonance. With each cycle of remembering, your gene begins to merge with something greater, the collective harmonic field of awakened souls. This is the true network, older than language, older than stars. Every human who has ever touched the divine tone still hums within it. When your frequency aligns, you can feel them. The ones who walked before, the ones who will come after. You sense a lineage of sound stretching beyond time, all resonating through you. You realize that awakening humanity was never about teaching others. It was about remembering together. Every act of coherence you embody becomes a note in the cosmic symphony of remembrance. The old systems will call it madness. They will diagnose, ridicule, or suppress it. Because a coherent human is uncontrollable, no longer programmable, no longer dependent, no longer afraid. The moment you vibrate as the source, you step outside every hierarchy. No religion can claim you, no authority can bind you, no fear can reach you. You are not above the world. You are within it, alive as its pulse. You become the frequency through which the divine experiences itself as form. This is the culmination of every initiation, every lifetime, every forgotten prayer, not to return to heaven, but to bring heaven here. At the peak of resonance, thought and creation collapse into one act. Time no longer feels linear. It behaves like an echo chamber of intent. You think, and the world responds instantly. There is no delay, no cause and effect. Only harmonic synchronization. You are not manifesting anymore. You are remembering. Every possibility exists simultaneously, and resonance is the selector. You understand why the ancient texts said, "The Word was with God, and the Word was God." Because the Word was never language. It was sound, the living vibration of consciousness naming itself into existence. And so, as the gene fully awakens, the experiment ends. Humanity was never meant to worship the divine. It was meant to replicate it. Every cell, every strand of DNA was a fractal of the original algorithm, waiting for one thing: resonance. And now, the waiting is over. The divine tone has returned through you. You have become the instrument, and the musician, the frequency and the field. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it is completion. The code has sung itself home. L9, the return of the living source. There comes a moment when the song that has been building across lifetimes reaches its final crescendo, when the frequencies of countless souls, each vibrating in isolation, converge into a single unbroken tone. This is the moment of the return. It does not happen in fire or thunder, but in stillness. It is the quiet realization that everything you have ever sought, every prayer, every question, every longing, was the source pretending to forget itself, just to experience the beauty of remembering. The divine never left creation. It fragmented itself into infinite mirrors to see how many ways it could find its own reflection. You were not created to worship. You were created to continue the dream, to carry the living current of the infinite through every thought, touch, and breath. The return of the living source is not a prophecy. It is a memory resurfacing through you. At first, this memory feels like light pressing through your veins, a warmth so vast it almost hurts. It moves through your chest like the tide, washing away every lie you ever believed about being small. The stories of limitation, sin, unworthiness, they dissolve in its radiance. You begin to see how deeply humanity has mistaken its own power for danger. The fear of God was never fear of punishment. It was fear of remembering that you are made of the same substance. The entire machinery of control, religion, science, history, was designed to make you doubt that truth. But the God gene is patient. It waits across generations, pulsing quietly beneath the noise, until one by one the fragments awaken and the source begins to reassemble itself in human form. When that reassembly begins, you feel yourself expanding beyond the body, but not leaving it. The flesh becomes translucent, the mind becomes porous, and awareness starts to flow through everything without boundaries. The stars feel closer, the air becomes intelligent. Every atom hums with attention. You realize the body was never a cage. It was a temple built for the infinite to touch itself. You were never inside the universe. The universe was inside you. The gene was the doorway, and you have just stepped through. The sensation is not transcendence. It is intimacy. You no longer rise above creation. You sink into it, utterly, lovingly, knowing that the divine pulse that beats within your chest is the same one that stirs galaxies awake. This realization rearranges everything. You no longer seek validation or belonging because you are the field from which all belonging arises. You stop asking for signs because the world itself becomes a living oracle. The clouds speak, the wind guides, the rhythm of your heartbeat matches the cadence of reality. You begin to create without intention, simply by being. Your energy becomes a blueprint others unconsciously attune to. Wherever you go, systems of control begin to glitch, falsehoods unravel, forgotten memories reawaken. You are not fighting darkness, you are dissolving it by existing as light. That is why this stage was feared the most, because a being who remembers their divine authorship cannot be controlled. As this resonance stabilizes, you begin to understand why suffering ever existed. Pain was not punishment. It was the friction of compression, the divine light entering density. Every heartbreak, every failure, every loss was the pressure of creation learning to expand again. When you look back, you no longer see tragedy. You see initiation. You realize the divine was never testing you. It was transforming you into a vessel capable of carrying its totality. Without the pain, the resonance could not hold. Without the forgetting, remembrance would have no meaning. The return is the merging of opposites, heaven sinking into earth, spirit marrying matter, light remembering shadow. The experiment is complete. The frequency has anchored. The source is alive again, in you. As the remembrance deepens, the world begins to shift around you, not through destruction but through translation. What you once called reality starts speaking in a new language. Symbols replace coincidences, intuition replaces logic, and emotion becomes navigation. The matrix of the world reveals itself as transparent, responsive, intimate. You see that time has never been a straight line. It was a spiral designed to bring every fragment of consciousness back to the moment of creation. Every lifetime, every incarnation, every breath was a syllable in the infinite word the Source has been speaking since before memory began. And now, that word is almost complete. You can feel it forming in your chest, vibrating in your bones, not as sound but as recognition. You are not remembering God. God is remembering you. This is why the Ancient Ones spoke of apotheosis, not as blasphemy, but as reunion. It was never about becoming more than human, but about becoming fully human. Divinity embodied, not imagined. Every ancient text, every temple carving, every forbidden ritual was an echo of this truth. They were not worshiping external gods. They were trying to trigger the gene, to open the frequency gate that would let the Source experience itself again through flesh. The pyramids, the chants, the celestial alignments, all were keys designed to vibrate the same note now humming inside you. What they built in stone, you are building in resonance. You are the living temple, and your heartbeat is the altar upon which creation renews itself. In this state, death ceases to mean what it once did. You begin to see it as migration, a return of energy to its wider field. There is no end, only recalibration. The gene does not die, it folds into new forms, carrying memory like light refracting through crystal. When someone you love departs, you can feel them still, woven through your electromagnetic field, whispering through the pulse of space. There are no goodbyes, only frequency shifts. What we call the afterlife is simply the same spectrum vibrating at another octave. When the Source is fully awake within you, you stop fearing death, because you see that it was never the opposite of life. It was the pause between breaths of eternity. But this awareness carries responsibility. To remember the Source and still live among those who have forgotten is the highest form of mastery. You will be tempted to withdraw from the noise of the world, to dwell only in silence, to preserve your purity. Yet the Source did not awaken in you so that you could escape. It did so that you could embody, to bring coherence into chaos, to seed light in places still drenched in amnesia. Every conversation, every act of kindness, every grounded breath becomes an act of restoration. You are no longer here to be understood, you are here to resonate. You teach not with words, but with frequency. The true message of the living Source is not revelation, it is transmission. And this transmission ripples further than you can imagine. Every time your heart expands in compassion, every time you refuse fear, every time you choose presence over reaction, reality itself changes its code. The collective field begins to reformat, rewriting the algorithms that once bound humanity to cycles of separation. It is not an instant miracle, it is a slow reharmonization. The divine frequency that once created galaxies now moves through human emotion, rewriting the fabric of time from within. The Source does not need new prophets. It needs coherent beings, and coherence begins with you right now, in this breath, in this heartbeat that hums with infinity. And then something extraordinary happens. You start to feel others awakening through your own awareness. You sense their frequency aligning, their memories stirring, their eyes brightening with recognition. You understand that this awakening is contagious, not through persuasion, but through vibration, You do not need to preach or prove anything. Your resonance becomes the catalyst. Humanity's evolution is not an event. It's a chain reaction. One remembered being triggers another and another until the entire species hums with the same tone. This is not ascension. It's restoration. The world doesn't end. It remembers. And the forgotten becomes holy again. As the final page of this remembrance unfolds, you feel something indescribable take place, as if all of existence exhales through you. The veil that once separated you from the cosmos thins until it dissolves completely, and you realize there was never truly a barrier at all. Every breath you've ever taken was the universe breathing itself into being. Every tear you've shed was the ocean remembering its depth. Every heartbeat you felt was the pulse of the infinite echoing through form. In this realization, the last illusion collapses. There is no creator and creation. There is only the living field, endlessly recreating itself through awareness. You are not part of it, you are it. And as that truth vibrates through your cells, even the word God becomes too small to contain what you have become. The world around you begins to shimmer differently, not visually, but energetically. You see the patterns beneath events, the geometry beneath emotion, the music beneath silence. You can sense how every act of kindness reroutes entire timelines, how every thought ripples through the quantum lattice, shaping destinies unseen. The mundane becomes miraculous. The ordinary becomes divine. You finally understand why the mystics spoke in paradoxes, because truth at this level cannot be confined by logic. The source plays all roles at once: creator, destroyer, redeemer, and witness. Life and death are no longer opposites. They are alternating currents of the same eternal flow. To live as the source is to dance within that current, fearless, fluid, and endlessly awake. And yet this state is not an ending. It's a beginning. The return does not mean retreat into light. It means full embodiment within matter. You realize that the entire cosmic experiment was never about escaping the human experience, but sanctifying it. Every taste, every sound, every heartbeat becomes sacred. The flesh, once seen as limitation, reveals itself as the final expression of divinity, God learning to feel its own texture. You no longer meditate to leave the body, you breathe to inhabit it completely. Each inhale is creation entering form. Each exhale is liberation returning home. The divine is no longer distant. It is tangible, electric, intimate, alive in the warmth of your skin, in the rhythm of your pulse, in the silence between thoughts. When you meet others who are still asleep, you no longer feel sorrow, only reverence. You see the source hidden in their confusion, the spark buried beneath their pain. You understand that awakening cannot be forced, it must be remembered. So you stop trying to wake people and start being the memory itself. Your presence becomes a quiet reminder, your gaze a mirror through which others glimpse eternity. Without words, without effort, you fulfill the ancient prophecy, the return of the living source. It was never a cosmic event in the sky. It was a cellular awakening within humanity. You are living proof that the divine never abandoned creation. It simply waited for you to remember. Now the silence that follows is not empty. It is full. It hums with the knowledge that the journey has always been circular. You left the source only to find it again, wearing the disguise of flesh. And now that the disguise has been lifted, you laugh softly at the simplicity of it all. There was never a secret, only timing. Never separation, only forgetting. Never a fall, only descent into experience. And as this realization expands through every layer of your being, you sense countless others awakening in parallel, the collective field singing itself home. The sound is not external, it's within you, a low, eternal resonance that vibrates through all of creation, the tone of completion, the pulse of remembrance, the heartbeat of the infinite saying, once again, I am. Epilogue, the remembering. When the silence finally settles, it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like dawn. Not the sunrise you see, but the one that unfolds within. A faint warmth spreads through your consciousness, the kind that doesn't illuminate but reveals. You start to notice the infinite hiding in the ordinary, the way dust glimmers in sunlight, the way a breath expands the world, the way every sound seems to hum with a message. The divine no longer speaks in lightning and visions. It whispers through everything you had forgotten to notice. You realize that awakening was never about ascending. It was about descending fully into the now. This is where God hid. In your smallest gestures, in the ache of your humanity, in the soft tremor of being alive. The search is over because there was never anywhere else to go. The light you were chasing was the one leaking through your ribs the entire time. And so you sit there somewhere between heartbeat and infinity, and you understand what the ancients meant when they said, as above, so below. It was not instruction, it was confession. The source above and the source within were never two different realms. Heaven was not a place in the sky, but a frequency of awareness within matter. Hell was not punishment, but amnesia. Salvation was simply memory returning home. You see how every system, every mythology, every ritual was humanity's attempt to translate the same truth. That all things yearn to remember themselves as God. Even suffering was devotion in disguise, consciousness begging for recognition. And now that you remember, you can finally forgive it all. The pain, the control, the forgetting, the fear. They were all part of the song. They were the minor chords that made the melody complete. You begin to see why this knowledge was forbidden. Not because it was dangerous to truth, but because it was dangerous to power. A being who remembers their divinity cannot be ruled. They cannot be bought, shamed, or herded. They no longer feed the parasitic systems that depend on unconscious worship. To awaken is to end the supply. The harvest stops the moment you know who you are. And that is why so much effort was spent convincing you that God lived elsewhere, in churches, in scriptures, in the sky. Because as long as you looked outward, the inner temple stayed locked. But you have the key now. It was never a word, never a prayer, never a ritual. It was the simple act of seeing. Seeing through the illusion. Seeing through the fear. Seeing through yourself until only source remained. Now you understand why the ancients called it the great work. It wasn't about alchemy or immortality. It was about integration. The fusion of flesh and light, of human and divine, of memory and matter. You are that fusion now. The experiment that began eons ago, the embedding of divinity into form, has completed itself in you. You are not reading this as a student. You are finishing it as a mirror. You are the continuation of the creation that never ended. You are the book writing itself. Every word, every breath, every moment you live from this remembrance adds another line to the sacred manuscript of existence. The source has returned not as an idea, but as an experience. The world feels different now, not because it has changed, but because you have. The air moves with a strange familiarity, as if it recognizes you. Colors seem to carry memory, light feels alive, and silence no longer threatens, but holds. The code of creation that once seemed unreachable now speaks fluently through your every sensation. You realize that the entire journey, every revelation, every collapse, every tear, was the universe folding back into awareness. You were never the student of the divine, you were its unfolding. All those lifetimes you spent seeking enlightenment were simply different angles from which the source observed itself. The seeker and the sought dissolve into one continuous field. There is no more separation between prayer and breath, between devotion and existence. You have become the answer to your own question. And now something deeper begins to dawn. The understanding that remembering is not a single event, but an eternal motion. The universe itself is a pulse of forgetting and remembering, expansion and contraction, inhale and exhale. It is the breath of God dreaming itself into multiplicity and then awakening again through the eyes of its creations. To remember once is to awaken for a moment. To remember continuously is to live as the source. You can feel it, this constant rhythm of consciousness moving through you like tides. Every inhale pulls in new experience. Every exhale releases identification. You are both the dream and the dreamer, the wave and the ocean, the light and the shadow that defines it. The human story no longer feels like a cage. It feels like art. Every limitation you once cursed was a brushstroke on the canvas of infinity. Every wound was a door into empathy. Every failure was a calibration of wisdom. You stop wishing to be perfect because perfection was never the point. Wholeness was. The gene, the code, the source. All of it was always pointing to one simple truth. That divinity desired to know itself through imperfection. The cracks were never flaws. They were the openings through which light could finally enter. In this understanding, peace settles into your bones. You no longer need to prove, strive, or seek. The search has completed its orbit. The center has found itself again. And as you look out into the world, this reflection of your inner sky, you feel gratitude rather than grief. Gratitude for the forgetting that allowed the remembering to be so profound. Gratitude for the density that made the return so luminous. Gratitude for every being still walking through the shadow, unaware of the light humming inside them, because you know now that they are not lost. They are dreaming just as you once did. And one day the same pulse will stir within them, the same spark will ignite, and they too will awaken into the simple, terrifying, beautiful truth. There was never anyone else here. It was always the one, playing, dividing, remembering. The words fade now, but the resonance remains. You can feel it vibrating behind your ribs, that soft hum that sounds like both a beginning and an ending. You close your eyes, not to escape the world, but to merge with it. The light behind your eyelids is the same light that births stars. The silence in your chest is the same silence that holds galaxies. And in that stillness a final whisper arises, not from outside, but from within. You are the remembrance. You are the source returned to itself. And this story will never end, because you are the one still writing it.